Okay, we are continuing through the New Testament and a little bit disjointed this week because we're finishing the last two chapters of Philippians and then jumping to the book of Hebrews. And so two different things, but we'll talk about each of them. And I just referred to what we said last week about the book of Philippians, how it is in large part a thank you letter written by Paul to the church at Philippi. And in fact, in this week's reading, chapter 4, it really demonstrates that. Paul ends his letter, remember, writing from prison. He ends his letter by thanking them in chapter 4 for the help, the financial assistance it seems that they had sent to him. And they sent that at the hand of Epaphroditus, who we talked about in chapter 2. And Paul is sending this letter back with him to the church at Philippi, thanking them as well as updating them on his situation and using his situation to encourage them. Specifically, I think as we saw last week, to dwell or to live together and to work together in more and more unity. And remember that the heart of that unity in chapter 2 is modeling the selflessness of Jesus, who did not count equality with God something to be held on to, but he emptied himself, he humbled himself, and through his humility and his obedience, he did the will of God. And so that's really the theme that Paul is working with to encourage these Christians in Philippi to not regard their own needs and regard themselves, but to count other people as more important, and to work together and to strive together as one body in the Lord. Now, probably not going to surprise you because we've seen it in Galatians already, as well as in Ephesians. But Philippians 3 seems to also address this Jew-Gentile problem. And he warns about people that will come in and preach circumcision. And think about how that fits here, because this doctrine of circumcision, of Gentiles need to be circumcised in order to be Christians, that is a divisive doctrine. It is one that not only splits Jews and Gentiles, but it also exalts Jews over Gentiles and makes Gentiles into second-class citizens in the kingdom, so to speak. And so it makes sense within the theme of Philippians that Paul is repudiating that idea. And he actually uses himself again as an example and says that he has every right to boast in his Judaism and in his commitment to the customs of the law of Moses. And yet he has forsaken all of that. He counts all of that as loss for the sake of Jesus. And he counts all things, he says, as loss. He humbles himself because he seeks for one day. And that's what he's encouraging his readers to in chapter 3 especially, and saying to beware of the teaching of the circumcision, to beware of those at the end of chapter 3 that he says are walking according to the flesh and satisfying their own natural desires. And saying that we, Jew and Gentile, together in the Lord, our citizenship is in heaven, and we're waiting for him to return and to transform our bodies to be like his glorious body. And then we see in chapter 4, I think, one more encouragement as Paul thanks and closes the letter in thanks to the Philippians. More of these encouragements to unity and to working together, and again using his own example of saying that he is able to get by in whatever circumstance, because again he doesn't consider himself, but he considers everything to be about the Lord. I can do all things, live in abundance, live in humble means, because he's simply concerned about the Lord. And it's that attitude that will allow the Philippians and us, of course, to dwell in unity and to work together in unity in the way that he describes. Okay, now pivoting over to the book of Hebrews. Hebrews is a book that we don't know who the author is, and we don't know a lot of specific information about the readers of the book of Hebrews, except that they are Hebrews. It seems that it is primarily a Jewish audience. Because we see lots of references. In some ways, the whole book of Hebrews is referring to things that these readers would have been familiar with in the Old Covenant and in what we call the Old Testament. And we also know about these readers from what's written in the book that they are people that have committed themselves to Jesus and did so at great cost. It seems like they, when they were first became followers of Jesus, they endured persecution. They made great sacrifices, but some time has passed, and there's language throughout the book that indicates that maybe they have grown apathetic to some degree, grown indifferent, grown tired in their service to Christ. And it seems that over time as well, pressure has mounted from people around them. So persecution, maybe even subtle things like social ostracism, easy for me to say, and pressure maybe from friends, from family, from society. We don't know, again, where these readers are, but imagine they're in maybe in Jerusalem and Judea, and the pressure that grows over time from those around them. And so if there is one exhortation of the book of Hebrews, if there's one message that the writer of Hebrews wants to get across to his readers, it is don't give up. Don't give up on Jesus. These readers are being tempted because they're worn down over time and through the pressure of the book of Hebrews, is that Jesus is greater. And so throughout the book, he is going to compare Jesus and his superiority to all these different things. He begins in chapters 1 and 2 that we read this week with talking about Jesus' superiority to angels. And notice that with each of these things, he is going to give them an exhortation based on Jesus' superiority. And so in chapters 1 and 2, Jesus is greater than angels. And so his message ought to be listened to, because if the message of angels is true and people are held accountable to it, then the message of Jesus is that much more important and should be listened to. And Jesus' superiority to angels makes it even more remarkable how he was made lower than the angels and came to be made flesh and blood like his brothers, like us, in order to save us from the fear of death and to give us eternal life. But he'll go on in chapters 3 and 4. He'll talk about Jesus being greater than Moses and even perhaps than Joshua, and his ability to lead his people into the promised rest. But notice that with that, there comes an exhortation that if you're following Jesus, we need to learn from the mistakes of those who followed Moses and Joshua and didn't enter into the rest of the promised land. And so Jesus is a greater deliverer. And so we need to accept his deliverance and attain and make sure we don't miss out on the promised and remaining Sabbath rest that is for God's people. And that's really how this book works, at least through the first several chapters, is that the writer is showing how great Jesus is. He's referring to the things that they're familiar with in the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament, showing how Jesus is better than all these things. And in that, he's encouraging them to not give up on Jesus, but to hold fast to him, to hold on to him, because he is greater than anything else you could turn to, and to turn to something else would be to miss out on this great and wonderful hope that is available only in Jesus and not in any of these other things. And so that's the beginning of the book of Hebrews, and the next 2 weeks will be fully devoted to the rest of the book. And so we'll talk about that when we get to it. All right, thanks.